The morning sun cast long shadows across Davis-Monthan Air Force Base as Marcus Washington pushed his cleaning cart through the aircraft maintenance hangar. The wheels squeaked rhythmically against the concrete floor, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over the past 18 months. At 42 years old, Marcus had grown accustomed to being invisible to most of the airmen who hurried past him, their minds focused on flight schedules, maintenance reports, and the endless paperwork that kept the base running. Marcus wore the standard-issue blue coveralls of base maintenance staff, his name tag reading simply M. Washington, Custodial. What the tag didn't reveal was the 23 years he had spent as a pilot in the United States Air Force before a medical discharge forced him into early retirement. The heart condition that ended his flying career had been devastating, but not life-threatening enough to prevent him from working. Pride had kept him from accepting a desk job, and financial necessity had led him to this position cleaning the same aircraft he had once commanded with skill and precision. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now swept the floors around A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, the same aircraft he had flown in 3 combat deployments. Every morning, he walked past the familiar gray-green fuselage, the distinctive twin engines, and the massive GAU-8 cannon that made the aircraft legendary among ground troops. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid triggered memories he tried to keep buried, but they surfaced anyway like oil seeping through concrete. Captain Ryan Mitchell noticed the janitor more than most, though not for reasons that would have made Marcus comfortable. At 28, Mitchell embodied everything that annoyed the older ground crew about young officers. He had graduated from the Air Force Academy with honors, completed flight training near the top of his class, and carried himself with the confidence that came from never having faced real adversity. His flight suit was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to mirror brightness, and his attitude suggested he believed his own press releases about being the future of military aviation. Mitchell had been assigned to Davis-Monthan 6 months earlier, fresh from advanced combat training, eager to prove himself in his first operational squadron. He flew with technical precision but lacked the intuitive feel for the aircraft that separated good pilots from great ones. What he possessed in abundance was an ego that seemed to grow larger with each successful training mission and each casual conversation with fellow young officers about their eventual promotions to major and beyond. The morning routine in Hangar 7 followed the same pattern it had for months. Marcus arrived at 5:30, began his cleaning circuit, and worked methodically through each section while the early shift mechanics prepared aircraft for the day's training sorties. Captain Mitchell typically arrived around 7, reviewed maintenance logs, conducted his pre-flight briefings, and made his presence known to everyone within earshot. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was cleaning around A-10 tail number 78-0637, a veteran aircraft that had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. He moved carefully around the landing gear, paying attention to details that most custodial staff would miss. Old habits died hard, and Marcus found himself noting things like tire pressure, hydraulic leaks, and the general condition of external components. It wasn't his job anymore, but 18 months of civilian employment hadn't erased 2 decades of military discipline. Captain Mitchell emerged from the Squadron Operations Center with his flight gear, his helmet bag slung over his shoulder and his flight suit unzipped at the top in the casual style favored by pilots who wanted everyone to know they flew for a living. He was scheduled for a 2-hour training flight, practicing close air support scenarios with ground controllers at the Barry M. Goldwater range. It was routine work, the kind of mission he had flown dozens of times, but Mitchell approached each flight as if it were his personal audition for squadron commander. The captain noticed Marcus working near his assigned aircraft and felt the familiar urge to assert his authority. It wasn't personal animosity, exactly, but rather the kind of casual superiority that some officers displayed toward enlisted personnel and civilians. Mitchell had grown up in an upper-middle-class family where his father was a successful businessman and his mother was a prominent attorney. Military service was about honor and adventure for him, not economic necessity or family tradition. He had little understanding of the paths that led people to support roles on military bases. "Morning, Janitor," Mitchell called out, his tone carrying just enough condescension to establish the social hierarchy he believed existed between them. "Make sure you get all the dust off my bird. Can't have the enemy seeing us coming because of a dirty windscreen." Marcus looked up from his work, his expression neutral. He had heard similar comments countless times over the past year and a half. Most of the time, he let them pass without response. Arguing with officers was a luxury he couldn't afford, and his supervisor had made it clear that maintaining positive relationships with flight crews was part of his job description. But something in Mitchell's tone this morning struck him differently, perhaps because the young captain was standing next to an aircraft that Marcus had once known as intimately as his own car. Yes, sir, Marcus replied quietly, returning to his cleaning. He had learned that acknowledging officers' comments without engagement usually ended the interaction quickly. But Mitchell wasn't finished. He was feeling particularly confident this morning, having received praise from his squadron commander the previous week for his performance on a complex training exercise. The adrenaline rush of flying combined with the natural arrogance of youth made him feel invincible, and Marcus represented an easy target for demonstrating his superiority. You know, Mitchell continued, walking closer to where Marcus was working, I sometimes wonder if you guys who work around these aircraft ever think about what it would be like to actually fly one. Must be frustrating to spend your whole day cleaning something you'll never understand. The comment hit deeper than Mitchell could have known. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he continued working, moving his cleaning cloth over surfaces he had once checked during his own pre-flight inspections. The irony was so bitter he could taste it, but explaining his background would require revealing more about himself than he was prepared to share with someone like Mitchell. I imagine it takes considerable skill, sir, Marcus said carefully, his voice even but, with an undertone that a more perceptive person might have recognized as restrained emotion. Mitchell interpreted the response as the deference he expected from support personnel. He was warming to the theme now, enjoying what he perceived as an opportunity to educate the help about the complexities of military aviation. Several other pilots and crew chiefs were working in the hangar, and Mitchell was aware of their presence. Establishing his expertise in front of peers was almost as satisfying as the flying itself. Considerable skill doesn't begin to cover it, Mitchell said, unconsciously puffing out his chest. You've got to understand aerodynamics, weapons systems, tactical employment, emergency procedures. Then, there's the physical demands, pulling Gs, spatial orientation, hand-eye coordination. It's not something just anyone can do. Takes years of training and a special kind of person. Marcus nodded slowly, still cleaning. Inside, he was remembering his first A-10 flight training, the months of studying systems manuals, the countless hours in simulators, the gradual building of skills that eventually allowed him to employ the aircraft in combat with deadly precision. He remembered the weight of responsibility that came with carrying live ordnance, the split-second decisions that meant the difference between protecting friendly forces and causing tragic mistakes. Most vividly, he remembered the satisfaction of mastering a complex machine and using it to serve his country and protect his fellow soldiers. The A-10 is particularly demanding, Mitchell continued, patting the aircraft's nose gear with proprietary affection. She's not forgiving of mistakes. Every switch, every procedure has to be perfect. The margin for error when you're flying close air support is essentially zero. One mistake and you could hit friendly forces instead of the enemy. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Torres, one of the senior crew chiefs, was working on an aircraft 2 parking spots away. She had been listening to the conversation with growing irritation. Torres had 22 years in the Air Force, had deployed 8 times, and had little patience for young officers who felt compelled to lecture everyone around them about subjects they understood better from textbooks than from experience. She particularly disliked pilots who talked down to the maintenance personnel who kept their aircraft airworthy. Captain, Torres called out, your aircraft is ready for pre-flight. All maintenance actions are complete and documented. Mitchell turned toward her, slightly annoyed at the interruption of his impromptu lecture. Thank you, Sergeant Torres. I'll be right over. But, instead of moving toward his aircraft, Mitchell turned back to Marcus, apparently not finished with his demonstration of superior knowledge. The captain was enjoying the audience, and the maintenance crew's presence made the moment feel even more significant to him. In his mind, he was providing valuable education to the civilian staff about the important work being done by the flight crews. You know what the hardest part is? Mitchell asked rhetorically, not really expecting an answer from Marcus. It's not just flying the plane. Any decent pilot can take off and land safely in good conditions. The real challenge is employing the weapons systems effectively while managing threats, coordinating with ground forces, and maintaining situational awareness in a combat environment. That's what separates real combat pilots from weekend warriors. Marcus felt something shift inside him as he listened to Mitchell's lecture. The young captain wasn't wrong about the challenges of flying the A-10 in combat, but his tone suggested he was speaking from extensive experience rather than training exercises and flight simulators. Marcus had flown over Afghanistan, providing close air support for troops in contact with enemy forces. He had made life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and time pressure that would have overwhelmed most people. He had brought damaged aircraft home safely and had saved the lives of soldiers he had never met but would never forget. The cleaning cloth in Marcus's hand moved more slowly as memories flooded back. He remembered the radio calls from desperate ground controllers, the careful coordination required to employ weapons danger close to friendly positions, the satisfaction of seeing enemy positions neutralized while knowing he had helped fellow Americans go home safely. Those experiences felt both distant and immediate, like events that had happened to someone else but remained burned into his own memory. The weapons system integration is probably the most complex part, Mitchell continued, unaware of the change in Marcus's demeanor. The GAU-8 cannon alone has multiple firing modes, different ammunition types, ballistic computers that have to account for airspeed, altitude, range, target movement. Then, you add rockets and bombs with their own employment considerations. It takes years to master all the variables. Sergeant Torres had moved closer, ostensibly to check something on a nearby aircraft but actually listening to the conversation with increasing interest. She had worked on A-10s for most of her career and had developed a good sense for pilots who knew what they were talking about versus those who were reciting textbook knowledge. Mitchell's explanations were technically accurate but lacked the kind of specific details that came from extensive hands-on experience. Marcus finally stopped cleaning and stood up straight, looking directly at Captain Mitchell for the first time in the conversation. There was something different in his posture now, a subtle change that Torres noticed immediately. The deferential body language was gone, replaced by something that looked more like controlled tension. "You're absolutely right about the complexity, sir," Marcus said, his voice still respectful but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "The GAU-8 is particularly challenging when you're firing danger close to friendly positions. Getting the ballistic solution right while managing your approach angle and dealing with ground threats requires considerable experience." Mitchell looked at Marcus more closely, momentarily surprised by the specific nature of the comment. Most civilians wouldn't know terms like danger close or understand the technical challenges of employing the cannon in combat situations. But Mitchell was too focused on maintaining his position of authority to think deeply about what Marcus's knowledge might indicate. "Exactly," Mitchell said, though something in his tone suggested he was slightly off balance. "That's what I mean about it taking a special kind of person. Not everyone has the intellectual capacity or the physical skills to handle that kind of complexity under pressure." The condescension in Mitchell's voice was clear now, and Marcus felt 23 years of military discipline warring with 18 months of accumulated frustration. He thought about his medical discharge, the dreams that had ended with a cardiac irregularity that grounded him permanently, the transition from respected officer to invisible civilian employee. He thought about the young pilots like Mitchell who assumed that anyone who wasn't flying simply wasn't capable of flying. Staff Sergeant Torres was watching the interaction carefully now, her experienced eye noting subtle changes in body language and tone that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere unusual. She had seen enough confrontations between officers and enlisted personnel to recognize the warning signs, but something about this particular exchange felt different. The janitor's responses were too knowledgeable, too specific, and his posture was changing in ways that suggested military training. "The thing is," Marcus said slowly, his voice still calm but with an undertone of steel, "the A-10 isn't just about intellectual capacity or physical skills. It's about judgment, experience, and the ability to make the right decision when people's lives depend on it. That comes from time in the cockpit and time in combat, not from classroom lectures and training flights." Mitchell's confident expression faltered slightly. The janitor's words carried an authority that seemed inconsistent with his position, and the specific nature of his comments suggested knowledge that went beyond casual observation. For the first time in the conversation, Mitchell found himself wondering who he was actually talking to. "I suppose you think you understand what combat flying is like?" Mitchell asked, his tone becoming defensive. The question was meant to be rhetorical, a way of reasserting his superior position, but something in Marcus's expression made it feel more like a challenge than a dismissal. Marcus looked at the A-10 beside him, his hand resting on the landing gear strut. For a moment, the 18 months of cleaning aircraft and accepting condescending comments from young officers fell away. He remembered the weight of the helmet, the feel of the stick in his hand, the sight picture through the heads-up display as he lined up targets that threatened American soldiers. He remembered the pride of wearing the wings that had taken years to earn and the devastating loss of identity that came with having them taken away by medical necessity rather than personal failure. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that combat flying is something that should be discussed with appropriate respect for those who have actually done it." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither man was quite ready to address directly. Mitchell felt the first stirring of uncertainty, a sense that this conversation had moved beyond his control. Torres had stopped pretending to work on the nearby aircraft and was now openly listening, her expression suggesting she was beginning to understand something that Mitchell was still missing. The moment stretched out, filled with tension that had been building for months but had never been directly confronted. Marcus was balanced on the edge of revelation, torn between the safety of anonymity and the need to defend something that had once defined his entire existence. Mitchell was beginning to realize that his casual assumption of superiority might have been based on incomplete information, but his ego was not prepared to accept that possibility without a fight. The morning routine of Hangar 7 continued around them, but the dynamic between the captain and the janitor had fundamentally changed. What had started as casual condescension was becoming something more serious, a confrontation that would force both men to examine their assumptions about themselves and each other. The A-10 stood between them, silent witness to a conversation that was about to change everything. Captain Mitchell stared at Marcus for several seconds, his mind processing the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. The janitor's last comment about discussing combat flying with appropriate respect carried an implication that Mitchell wasn't quite ready to accept. In his experience, support personnel sometimes tried to sound knowledgeable about aircraft operations by repeating things they had overheard from pilots and crew chiefs, but Marcus's specific terminology and confident delivery suggested something different. "Look," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I appreciate that you've probably picked up some knowledge working around these aircraft, but there's a difference between hearing about flying and actually doing it. I've got over 800 hours in the A-10, including combat training scenarios that simulate every possible threat environment. I think I know what I'm talking about." Marcus felt the familiar weight of frustration settling in his chest. 800 hours was respectable for a young pilot, but Marcus had accumulated over 3,000 hours in the A-10 alone, with additional time in F-16s and training aircraft before that. The combat training scenarios Mitchell mentioned were valuable, but they couldn't replicate the real stress of flying over hostile territory with actual bullets and missiles being fired at you. Still, explaining his background would require admitting to his current circumstances, something his pride had prevented him from doing for 18 months. Staff Sergeant Torres moved closer, no longer pretending to work on other tasks. She had been around long enough to recognize the tension building between the two men, and her instincts told her this conversation was heading somewhere that might require intervention. Torres had also begun to suspect that the janitor knew more about A-10 operations than his job title would suggest. His comments were too precise, too informed by real experience rather than casual observation. 800 hours is certainly impressive, sir, Marcus said, his tone remaining respectful but with an undercurrent that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Combat training scenarios are valuable preparation. I'm sure they've taught you a great deal about aircraft systems and tactical employment. Mitchell caught the subtle emphasis on the word scenarios and felt his irritation growing. The implication that his training experience somehow didn't qualify as real expertise struck him as presumptuous coming from someone whose job involved pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. The challenge to his authority was subtle but unmistakable, and Mitchell's competitive nature wouldn't allow it to pass unanswered. "You seem to have a lot of opinions about pilot training for someone who cleans aircraft for a living," Mitchell said, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe you think you could do better? Maybe you think you understand these systems well enough to actually operate them?" The question was meant to be sarcastic, a way of highlighting the absurdity of a janitor questioning a trained military pilot's expertise. But, the moment the words left his mouth, Mitchell realized they could be interpreted as a challenge, and his ego immediately seized on the opportunity to make his point more dramatically. "You know what?" Mitchell continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to the idea forming in his mind. "If you think you understand this aircraft so well, maybe you'd like to demonstrate your knowledge. I dare you to start her up. Show everyone how much you really know about A-10 operations." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Torres felt her stomach drop as she realized what Mitchell had just proposed. Starting an aircraft without proper authorization was a serious violation of base regulations, potentially dangerous, and definitely the kind of incident that would bring unwanted attention from senior leadership. She opened her mouth to intervene, but Marcus spoke first. "That wouldn't be appropriate, sir," Marcus said quietly, though something in his expression had changed again. "Starting aircraft requires proper authorization and adherence to established procedures." Mitchell interpreted Marcus's response as backing down, confirmation that the janitor had been talking beyond his actual knowledge. The captain felt a surge of satisfaction at having exposed what he believed was empty posturing from someone trying to sound more knowledgeable than he actually was. But Mitchell's competitive instincts, combined with his need to prove his point in front of the maintenance crew, pushed him to escalate further. "Of course it wouldn't be appropriate," Mitchell said with a laugh that sounded more condescending than amused. "Because you don't actually know how to do it. You've been standing around listening to real pilots talk shop and now you think you understand something you've never actually done. It's typical civilian behavior, all talk and no substance." The insult hit Marcus harder than Mitchell could have known. Being dismissed as all talk by someone who had never faced real combat felt like a betrayal of every mission he had flown, every risk he had taken, every soldier he had protected from enemy fire. The accusation of being a civilian pretending to understand military operations cut particularly deep because it reduced his entire career to the 18 months of menial labor that represented only his most recent experience. Torres watched Marcus's face carefully and saw something that made her increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The janitor's expression was shifting from controlled frustration to something that looked more like cold anger. His posture was changing too, becoming more erect and purposeful in a way that reminded her of senior non-commissioned officers or experienced pilots preparing to make a point. "Captain," Torres interjected, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further, "perhaps we should focus on getting your aircraft ready for the scheduled mission. The operations center will be expecting you to check in soon." But Mitchell was too caught up in the moment to accept Torres's diplomatic intervention. He had committed to a position and his pride demanded that he follow through, especially with audience members present who would remember how the confrontation ended. The young captain had spent most of his military career being praised for his performance and had little experience with situations where his authority was questioned, even indirectly. "No, Sergeant, I think this is educational," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Our civilian employee here seems to think he understands aircraft operations well enough to critique pilot training. I think it's worth exploring exactly how much he really knows versus how much he just pretends to know." Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him as he listened to Mitchell's words. For 18 months, he had accepted condescension and dismissal as the price of employment he needed to pay his bills and maintain his health insurance. He had swallowed his pride countless times, allowed his expertise to be ignored, and permitted people with a fraction of his experience to lecture him about subjects he understood better than they ever would. The accumulation of small humiliations had been bearable because he had convinced himself that maintaining his job was more important than defending his ego. But, standing next to an aircraft he had once commanded with skill and distinction, listening to a pilot with minimal real-world experience dismiss him as a pretender, Marcus found his patience finally exhausted. The dare Mitchell had issued was reckless and inappropriate, but it had also inadvertently offered Marcus something he had been denied for months: an opportunity to demonstrate his actual capabilities rather than simply asserting them. "You're right, Captain," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone that Torres recognized as dangerous. "Actions speak louder than words. Perhaps a demonstration would be more instructive than further discussion." Mitchell felt a moment of uncertainty as he registered the change in Marcus's demeanor. The janitor's voice carried a confidence that seemed inconsistent with his position, and his willingness to accept the dare suggested either foolish bravado or knowledge that Mitchell hadn't accounted for. But the captain had committed to his challenge publicly, and backing down now would undermine his authority more than following through with whatever embarrassment was about to unfold. "Outstanding," Mitchell said, though he was beginning to feel less certain about the wisdom of his provocation. "Let's see what you can do. But when you can't even figure out how to turn on the battery, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that some things require actual training and expertise, not just casual observation." Marcus looked at the A-10 beside him, tail number 78-0637, an aircraft he remembered from his own flying days. He knew its maintenance history, its quirks, and its systems as well as any pilot currently assigned to the squadron. For a moment, he hesitated, understanding that what he was about to do would change everything. Once he demonstrated his knowledge, the comfortable anonymity he had maintained for 18 months would be gone forever. The questions that would follow would be difficult and, potentially embarrassing. But, the weight of accumulated frustration and the direct challenge to his competence made the decision easier. Marcus had spent 2 decades earning the respect that Mitchell was casually dismissing, and his pride finally refused to accept further humiliation in silence. If the captain wanted a demonstration of knowledge, Marcus was prepared to provide one that would settle the question permanently. "Very well, sir," Marcus said, moving toward the aircraft with purpose. "But I should mention that starting an aircraft without proper authorization might attract unwanted attention from leadership." "Are you certain you want to proceed?" The question was professionally phrased, but Torres heard it as a final warning, an opportunity for Mitchell to reconsider a course of action that was likely to have consequences beyond whatever point he was trying to prove. The sergeant found herself hoping that the captain would recognize the wisdom of backing down, but Mitchell's expression suggested he was too committed to his position to change course now. "I'm certain," Mitchell said firmly. "This is a training exercise, and I'm authorizing it as the pilot assigned to this aircraft. When you fail to accomplish anything meaningful, we'll call it a valuable lesson in the difference between real expertise and civilian speculation." Marcus nodded slowly, accepting both the authorization and the challenge. He walked to the left side of the aircraft and began moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had performed the same actions hundreds of times before. Torres watched with growing amazement as Marcus opened the access panel beneath the cockpit and began examining connections with the practiced eye of an experienced pilot rather than curious civilian. "The first step," Marcus said, speaking clearly enough for both Mitchell and Torres to hear, "is ensuring that all external power sources are disconnected and that the aircraft is properly configured for engine start. The battery switch is located on the left console, but activating it without completing the proper preliminary checks would be both dangerous and unprofessional." Mitchell felt his first real stab of uncertainty as he watched Marcus move around the aircraft with obvious familiarity. The janitor's actions were too confident, too practiced, and his commentary demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond casual observation. But Mitchell had committed to the confrontation and his ego wouldn't allow him to admit that he might have misjudged the situation. Marcus climbed into the cockpit with movements that Torres immediately recognized as those of an experienced pilot. He settled into the ejection seat with the automatic adjustments that came from muscle memory, his hands moving to switches and controls without the hesitation that would have characterized someone unfamiliar with the aircraft. The transformation from deferential janitor to confident aviator was so complete that Torres felt a chill of recognition. "Jesus," Torres whispered to herself, beginning to understand what she was witnessing. "He actually knows what he's doing." Marcus began the startup sequence with methodical precision, his hands moving to the correct switches in the proper order without reference to checklists or hesitation. The battery came online first, followed by the hydraulic systems, then the environmental controls. Each action was performed with the confidence of extensive experience, and the aircraft responded exactly as it was designed to do under the hands of a qualified pilot. The sound of systems activating filled the hangar, drawing attention from other maintenance personnel who stopped their own work to observe the unusual sight of the janitor apparently starting an A-10. The growing audience made Mitchell increasingly uncomfortable, but he was trapped by his own challenge and couldn't intervene without admitting that he had made a serious error in judgment. Marcus's voice carried clearly from the cockpit as he announced each major step in the process, his commentary demonstrating intimate knowledge of aircraft systems and procedures. APU start sequence initiated. Hydraulic pressure coming online. Environmental systems nominal. Engine start sequence commencing. The moment when the first engine began to turn was electric. The familiar whine of the turbine spinning up filled the hangar, followed by the deeper rumble of ignition and the steady roar of an A-10 engine at idle power. The sound was unmistakable and impossible to ignore, a declaration that someone in the cockpit knew exactly what they were doing and had the skills to prove it. Captain Mitchell stood frozen beside the aircraft, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The janitor he had been condescending to for months was demonstrating pilot skills that appeared to be not just adequate but expert. The sound of the engines meant that Marcus had successfully completed a complex startup sequence that required extensive training and experience, something that was impossible for someone who had merely observed aircraft operations from a distance. Staff Sergeant Torres found herself grinning despite the serious implications of what was happening. She had suspected for the past several minutes that Marcus was more than he appeared to be, but the evidence was now undeniable. The man in the cockpit was conducting an engine start with the casual competence of an experienced A-10 pilot, and every action he had taken was textbook perfect. The second engine came online with the same smooth precision as the first, and Marcus's voice continued to provide commentary that demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge but practical expertise. His communication was crisp and professional, using terminology and procedures that could only come from extensive flight training and operational experience. "Both engines stabilized at ground idle," Marcus announced. "All engine parameters nominal. Hydraulic systems functioning normally. Aircraft is fully operational and ready for taxi." The implications of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone present. Marcus had not only accepted Mitchell's dare but had executed it flawlessly, demonstrating skills that required years of training and experience to develop. The casual competence with which he had started the aircraft suggested that he was not a janitor who had somehow learned to fly, but rather a pilot who was currently working as a janitor. Captain Mitchell felt his worldview shifting as he confronted the reality that his assumptions about the man he had been dismissing for months were completely wrong. The sound of the A-10 engines was proof of expertise that couldn't be faked or learned through casual observation. Marcus had just demonstrated that he possessed the very skills that Mitchell had been lecturing him about, and had done so with a level of competence that suggested extensive experience. The noise of the running engines had attracted attention throughout the hangar and beyond. Other pilots and maintenance personnel were gathering to investigate the unexpected sound of an aircraft starting during a period when no flights were scheduled. The growing crowd meant that whatever happened next would have multiple witnesses, ensuring that the incident would quickly become known throughout the squadron and, potentially, the entire base. Marcus sat in the cockpit, feeling the familiar vibration of the engines and the sensation of controlling a machine he had once known as well as his own body. For the first time in 18 months, he felt like himself again, connected to his identity as a pilot rather than hiding behind the anonymity of a service job. But he was also acutely aware that what he had just done would have consequences that would extend far beyond proving a point to an arrogant young captain. The engines continued to run steadily, their sound echoing through the hangar and across the flight line, announcing to everyone within hearing distance that something unusual was happening in Hangar 7. The moment of demonstration had passed, but the implications were just beginning to unfold. The sound of jet engines running in Hangar 7 reached Colonel Sarah Bennett's office 3 buildings away. As the 355th Fighter Squadron's commanding officer, Bennett had developed an ear for aircraft operations that bordered on supernatural. She could distinguish between different aircraft types by sound alone, identify engine problems from subtle changes in pitch, and knew immediately when something was happening that wasn't supposed to be happening. The rumble currently echoing across the base was definitely an A-10, and, according to her schedule, no aircraft were supposed to be running engines for another 2 hours. Bennett pushed back from her desk and moved to the window overlooking the flight line. At 45 years old, she had commanded the squadron for 18 months and had seen enough unusual situations to know that unexpected engine runs usually meant either emergency situations or serious procedural violations. Either possibility required immediate investigation. She grabbed her flight cap and headed for the door, her long stride carrying her quickly across the concrete toward Hangar 7. The colonel's reputation preceded her wherever she went on Davis Monthan. Bennett had flown combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, had commanded at every level from flight lead to squadron commander, and was known throughout the Air Force as someone who demanded excellence but treated people fairly. She was equally comfortable discussing tactics with combat pilots or maintenance procedures with crew chiefs, and she had earned the respect of both officers and enlisted personnel through competence rather than rank alone. As Bennett approached the hangar, she could see a crowd gathering around one particular aircraft parking spot. The growing number of people confirmed that whatever was happening was significant enough to draw attention from across the maintenance area. The colonel's expression remained neutral, but her mind was already running through possible scenarios and the appropriate responses to each one. Unauthorized engine runs were serious matters that could result in disciplinary action, safety violations, or worse. Inside the hangar, Marcus continued to manage the aircraft systems with the practiced ease of extensive experience. Both engines were running smoothly at ground idle, all systems were functioning normally, and the A-10 was responding exactly as it should under the hands of a qualified pilot. But Marcus was increasingly aware that his demonstration had attracted more attention than either he or Captain Mitchell had anticipated. The growing crowd of onlookers meant that what had started as a private confrontation was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. Captain Mitchell stood beside the aircraft in a state of shock that was becoming more profound with each passing minute. The reality that the janitor he had been condescending to possess genuine pilot skills was forcing him to re-evaluate not just his assumptions about Marcus, but his entire understanding of the situation he had created. The dare that had seemed like a safe way to prove his superiority had backfired spectacularly, and Mitchell was beginning to understand that the consequences might extend far beyond personal embarrassment. Staff Sergeant Torres watched the proceedings with a mixture of admiration for Marcus's skills and growing concern about the official response that would inevitably follow. She had worked around aircraft long enough to know that unauthorized engine starts were the kind of incidents that generated investigations, paperwork, and potentially serious disciplinary action for everyone involved. The sergeant was also beginning to piece together clues about Marcus's background that suggested his current employment situation might be more complicated than anyone had realized. The crowd around the aircraft continued to grow as word spread through the maintenance area that something extraordinary was happening. Senior Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, the squadron's maintenance superintendent, pushed through the gathering personnel with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of unusual situations. Hayes had 28 years in the Air Force and had seen enough strange incidents to know that crowd control was often as important as addressing the immediate problem. "All right, everyone back to work," Hayes commanded in a voice that carried the authority of 3 decades of military service. "This isn't a spectator event. If you don't have business here, find somewhere else to be." The crowd reluctantly began to disperse, but several key personnel remained, including the pilots and crew chiefs who were directly involved in the day's flying schedule. Hayes approached the aircraft and immediately assessed the situation with the practiced eye of an experienced maintenance professional. The A-10 was running normally, showing no signs of problems, but the identity of the person in the cockpit was definitely not what Hayes had expected to see. "Torres," Hayes called out, his voice cutting through the engine noise, "what the hell is going on here? Why is there a civilian in the cockpit of a combat aircraft?" Before Torres could respond, the distinctive sound of Colonel Bennett's voice carried across the hangar. "Good question, Senior Master Sergeant. I'd like to hear the answer myself." The colonel's arrival transformed the atmosphere in the hangar immediately. Personnel who had been casually observing the situation suddenly found important tasks that required their immediate attention elsewhere. Captain Mitchell felt his stomach drop as he realized that his squadron commander was about to become personally involved in what had started as a minor confrontation with a janitor. The implications of having to explain his role in the current situation to Colonel Bennett were becoming clearer and more uncomfortable by the minute. Bennett approached the aircraft with the measured pace of someone gathering information before making decisions. She could see that both engines were running smoothly and that whoever was in the cockpit was managing the aircraft professionally. The lack of any emergency vehicles or maintenance personnel indicated that this wasn't a crisis situation, which meant it was likely a disciplinary matter that would require careful investigation. "Captain Mitchell," Bennett said, her tone indicating that she expected immediate and complete answers, "perhaps you could explain why there's an unauthorized person operating one of my aircraft." Mitchell struggled to find words that would explain the situation without making his own role sound as foolish as he now realized it had been. The confidence he had felt when issuing his dare to Marcus had evaporated completely, replaced by the growing recognition that he had made a serious error in judgment that would likely have career implications. "Ma'am," Mitchell began, his voice lacking its usual confidence, we were discussing aircraft operations with the maintenance staff, and there was some question about the complexity of startup procedures. I authorized a demonstration to clarify certain technical points." Bennett's expression didn't change, but Torres saw something in the colonel's eyes that suggested she was not impressed with Mitchell's explanation. The colonel had commanded enough pilots to recognize evasive language when she heard it, and Mitchell's careful phrasing clearly indicated that he was trying to minimize his responsibility for whatever had actually occurred. "A demonstration," Bennett repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "And you felt qualified to authorize a civilian employee to operate a combat aircraft for educational purposes?" The question hung in the air with the weight of obvious implications about Mitchell's judgment and understanding of regulations. Bennett was giving the captain an opportunity to provide additional context that might explain his decision, but her tone suggested that she had already formed preliminary conclusions about the appropriateness of his actions. Marcus, listening to the conversation from the cockpit, realized that Captain Mitchell was about to face serious consequences for what had been intended as a humiliating practical joke. Despite his anger at the young officer's condescending behavior, Marcus found himself reluctant to allow someone else to take full responsibility for his own decision to accept the dare. The situation had escalated beyond a simple confrontation between two individuals and was now involving people who had played no role in the original dispute. The sound of the engines continued to fill the hangar, a constant reminder that an unusual situation was unfolding that would require official explanation and documentation. Marcus knew that he could shut down the aircraft and walk away, allowing Mitchell to face whatever consequences followed, but his sense of professional integrity wouldn't permit someone else to take sole responsibility for what had been a mutual decision. "Colonel," Marcus called out from the cockpit, his voice carrying clearly over the engine noise, "perhaps I could provide some additional context about what happened here." Bennett turned toward the aircraft with interest, noting that the person in the cockpit was communicating with the confidence and professionalism she would expect from an experienced pilot. The fact that he was willing to speak directly to her rather than allowing Mitchell to control the narrative suggested that there were aspects of the situation that hadn't been fully explained. "By all means," Bennett replied. "I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on how you came to be operating one of my aircraft." Marcus began shutting down the engines with the same methodical precision he had demonstrated during the startup sequence. Each step was performed in the correct order with obvious familiarity, and the aircraft systems responded smoothly under his control. The process took several minutes, during which the hangar gradually became quiet enough for normal conversation. When the shutdown was complete, Marcus climbed out of the cockpit and stood at attention beside the aircraft. His posture and bearing immediately caught Bennett's attention because they were unmistakably military in character. The man standing before her carried himself like someone with extensive service experience, not like a civilian employee with no military background. "Ma'am," Marcus began, his voice carrying the respectful tone of someone addressing a senior officer, "my name is Marcus Washington. I'm currently employed as custodial staff for base operations, but I'm also a retired Air Force pilot with over 3,000 hours in the A-10. The revelation hit everyone present like a physical blow. Colonel Bennett felt her understanding of the situation shift completely as she processed what Marcus had just revealed. Captain Mitchell stared at Marcus in stunned silence, finally comprehending the magnitude of his misjudgment. Staff Sergeant Torres and Senior Master Sergeant Hayes exchanged glances that reflected their amazement at the unexpected turn of events. "You're a pilot," Bennett said, her statement carrying implications that everyone present understood. A retired Air Force pilot working as a janitor suggested a story that was likely both complicated and potentially tragic. The colonel's tone shifted from official inquiry to something approaching personal concern as she began to understand that she was dealing with a situation that involved one of her own profession. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I retired from the Air Force 18 months ago with a medical discharge. Heart condition that ended my flying career. I've been working civil service since then, to maintain my health insurance and support my family." The simple explanation carried emotional weight that resonated with everyone who heard it. Bennett understood immediately that Marcus was dealing with the devastating transition from military pilot to civilian employee, a change that would be psychologically difficult under any circumstances but particularly challenging when it involved working around the aircraft he could no longer fly professionally. "And how did you come to be demonstrating engine start procedures this morning?" Bennett asked, her tone indicating that she wanted the complete story rather than the diplomatic version Mitchell had attempted to provide. Marcus looked at Captain Mitchell, giving the young officer an opportunity to explain his role in the situation. But Mitchell remained silent, apparently unable to find words that would accurately describe his behavior without acknowledging its inappropriateness. The captain's silence left Marcus to provide the full context that Bennett was clearly expecting to hear. Captain Mitchell was explaining the complexity of A-10 operations to the maintenance staff, Marcus said carefully. During the course of that discussion, he expressed doubt about whether someone in my position could understand the technical aspects of aircraft systems. He challenged me to demonstrate my knowledge by starting the aircraft. I accepted his challenge, perhaps unwisely, but I felt that my experience qualified me to do so safely. Bennett absorbed the explanation while observing both men's body language and expressions. Marcus's account was diplomatic but clear about the essential facts, while Mitchell's obvious discomfort suggested that the full story involved elements that reflected poorly on his judgment and leadership. The colonel was beginning to understand that she was dealing with multiple issues that would require careful handling. "Captain Mitchell," Bennett said, turning her attention back to the young officer, "is Mr. Washington's account accurate? Did you challenge a subordinate employee to operate a combat aircraft?" Mitchell felt the weight of his squadron commander's attention and knew that his response would significantly influence how the incident was handled officially. His options were limited to acknowledging his poor judgment or attempting to minimize his role, and neither alternative offered much hope for avoiding serious consequences. "Yes, ma'am," Mitchell said quietly. "That's essentially what happened. I made an error in judgment and created a situation that violated several regulations. I take full responsibility for my actions." Bennett nodded slowly, appreciating Mitchell's willingness to accept responsibility even though his confession confirmed that he had acted inappropriately. The colonel was also impressed with the way Marcus had handled both the aircraft operation and the subsequent explanation, demonstrating professionalism that reflected well on his military background. Mr. Washington, Bennett said, your aircraft handling was obviously competent, but I'm sure you understand that what happened here raises several serious issues about authorization, safety protocols, and adherence to base regulations. Yes, ma'am, Marcus replied. I understand completely. I should have declined Captain Mitchell's challenge regardless of my qualifications. My personal frustrations don't excuse violating established procedures. The colonel found herself dealing with a situation that was more complex than the simple disciplinary matter she had initially expected. Both men had acknowledged their mistakes and accepted responsibility for their actions, but the underlying circumstances suggested deeper issues that deserved consideration. Marcus's background as an experienced pilot provided context for his technical competence, while Mitchell's behavior indicated problems with judgment and leadership that required attention. Senior Master Sergeant Hayes had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding of the human dynamics involved. As someone with extensive experience managing both officers and enlisted personnel, Hayes recognized that the incident reflected broader issues about respect, assumptions, and the way people treated each other based on current position rather than background and experience. Colonel, Hayes interjected respectfully, if I may make an observation, this situation might offer some valuable lessons about how we interact with all base personnel, regardless of their current job assignments. Bennett looked at Hayes with interest, recognizing that her senior enlisted advisor was offering perspective that might help her address not just the immediate incident but also the underlying issues that had contributed to it. The colonel was always willing to consider input from experienced personnel who understood the human aspects of military operations. Go ahead, Senior, Bennett said. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Hayes looked at both Marcus and Mitchell before responding, his expression suggesting that he was choosing his words carefully to address the situation constructively rather than simply assigning blame or criticism. Ma'am, Hayes said, I think what we've witnessed here demonstrates the importance of treating all personnel with respect and avoiding assumptions about people's capabilities based solely on their current positions. Mr. Washington has been working in our hangar for over a year, and I suspect many of us could have learned from his experience if we had taken the time to ask about his background. The observation was diplomatically phrased but carried clear implications about the way Marcus had been treated by various personnel over the past 18 months. Bennett understood that Hayes was suggesting the incident reflected broader cultural issues that deserved attention beyond simply addressing the immediate rule violations. Colonel Bennett looked around the hangar, noting the small group of personnel who had remained to observe the resolution of the situation. She realized that her handling of the incident would send messages about leadership, accountability, and the values she expected from her squadron. The decision she made in the next few minutes would influence not just the immediate participants but also the broader unit culture. Colonel Bennett stood quietly for a moment, processing the multiple layers of what had just unfolded in her hangar. The sound of normal base operations continued around them, but the small group gathered around aircraft 78-0637 existed in a bubble of tension that demanded careful resolution. As a squadron commander, Bennett had dealt with various disciplinary issues, but this situation was unique in ways that required more nuanced handling than standard regulatory responses. Mr. Washington, Bennett said, I'd like to speak with you privately in a few minutes. But, first, I want to address the immediate situation with Captain Mitchell. The colonel turned to face the young officer, her expression serious but not hostile. Bennett had commanded enough pilots to understand that Mitchell's behavior, while inappropriate, stemmed from immaturity and poor judgment rather than malicious intent. The captain was clearly shaken by the revelation of Marcus's background and appeared to be genuinely processing the implications of his actions. Captain, Bennett continued, your decision to dare a subordinate employee to operate a combat aircraft demonstrated poor judgment and violated multiple safety protocols. However, I'm more concerned about the attitude that led to that decision than I am about the specific incident itself. Mitchell stood at attention, his face reflecting the shame and embarrassment he felt about his behavior. The past hour had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own arrogance and the way he had been treating people he perceived as beneath his station. The revelation of Marcus's background had been particularly devastating because it highlighted how wrong his assumptions had been. Ma'am, Mitchell said, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort, I understand that my behavior was unacceptable. I allowed my ego to override my judgment, and I treated Mr. Washington with disrespect based on assumptions that were both wrong and inappropriate. I request that any disciplinary action focus on my actions rather than his response to my challenge. Bennett nodded, appreciating Mitchell's willingness to accept responsibility and his recognition that Marcus had been responding to provocation rather than acting independently. The colonel was also pleased to see that the captain appeared to be learning from the experience rather than simply trying to minimize his consequences. "Your request is noted, Captain," Bennett said. "However, both of you violated regulations this morning, and there will be administrative consequences for both parties. The difference is that Mr. Washington's violations occurred in response to inappropriate pressure from a superior, while yours demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for regulations and personnel." The colonel paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing with the specific actions she intended to take. Bennett understood that her response would be observed closely by other squadron personnel and would set precedents for how similar situations might be handled in the future. "Captain Mitchell, you will report to my office at 1400 hours to discuss the formal administrative actions that will result from this incident. You will also prepare a written statement explaining your decision-making process and the lessons you've learned from this experience. Additionally, you will personally apologize to every member of the maintenance staff who witnessed your behavior this morning." Mitchell accepted the punishment without argument, understanding that it was both appropriate and significantly less severe than what could have been imposed for his violations. The requirement to apologize to the maintenance staff was particularly fitting because it would force him to acknowledge his disrespectful treatment of people whose work was essential to flight operations. "Yes, ma'am," Mitchell said. "I understand and accept the consequences of my actions." Bennett turned her attention to Marcus, who had been standing quietly throughout the exchange with Mitchell. The colonel was struck by Marcus's bearing and professionalism, qualities that were clearly the product of extensive military experience. She was also aware that his situation represented a human tragedy that deserved consideration beyond simple rule enforcement. "Mr. Washington," Bennett said, "while I understand the provocation you faced this morning, your decision to accept Captain Mitchell's challenge also violated base regulations. However, your aircraft handling was exemplary, and your subsequent conduct has been professional throughout this incident." Marcus nodded, accepting both the criticism and the acknowledgement of his competence. He had expected some form of disciplinary action for his role in the incident, but he was grateful that Colonel Bennett seemed to understand the context that had led to his actions. "Ma'am," Marcus said, "I accept full responsibility for my decision to operate the aircraft without proper authorization. I allowed personal frustration to override my judgment, and I apologize for creating a situation that reflected poorly on squadron operations." Bennett studied Marcus carefully, noting details about his bearing and communication that reinforced her impression that she was dealing with someone whose current circumstances didn't reflect his actual capabilities or background. The colonel was beginning to formulate an idea that might address both the immediate disciplinary requirements and the broader human resource issues suggested by Marcus's situation. "Mr. Washington, your administrative consequences will be significantly less severe than Captain Mitchell's, given the circumstances that led to your actions. However, I'm more interested in discussing your current situation and whether there might be opportunities for you to contribute to squadron operations in ways that better utilize your experience and expertise." The unexpected turn in the conversation caught Marcus off guard. He had been prepared for disciplinary action and possible termination from his custodial position, but Colonel Bennett's words suggested she might be considering alternatives that he hadn't dared to hope for during his 18 months of civilian employment. "Ma'am," Marcus said carefully, "I appreciate your consideration, but my medical discharge prevents me from returning to flight status. My heart condition is permanent, and I understand that it disqualifies me from piloting duties." Bennett nodded, indicating she understood the medical limitations that had ended Marcus's flying career. But the colonel was thinking beyond pilot assignments to other roles where his experience and expertise could contribute to squadron effectiveness while accommodating his physical restrictions. "I'm not talking about returning you to flight status," Bennett said. "But there are numerous positions within squadron operations that require pilot-level knowledge of aircraft systems, tactics, and procedures. Your background could be invaluable in roles involving pilot training, maintenance liaison, or mission planning." The possibility that Bennett was describing seemed almost too good to be true to Marcus. For 18 months, he had felt like his military experience was being wasted in a job that required none of his skills or knowledge. The prospect of returning to work that utilized his expertise while accommodating his medical limitations represented a form of redemption he had stopped believing was possible. Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been listening to the conversation with growing interest, stepped forward with obvious enthusiasm for the direction Bennett was taking. Torres had worked with numerous pilots throughout her career and understood how valuable Marcus's experience could be in improving communication between flight crews and maintenance personnel. Ma'am, Torres interjected respectfully, if I may add my perspective, Mr. Washington's knowledge of A-10 systems has been evident during his custodial work. He's noticed maintenance issues that others have missed, and his understanding of aircraft operations has been apparent to anyone who paid attention to his work. Bennett looked at Torres with interest, recognizing that the sergeant's observations provided additional context for understanding Marcus's capabilities and potential contributions. The colonel was also pleased to see that at least some squadron personnel had recognized Marcus's expertise even before the morning's dramatic revelation.
Thank you, Sergeant Torres, Bennett said.
Your input confirms what I've observed this morning about Mr.
Washington's knowledge and professionalism.
Senior Master Sergeant Hayes nodded in agreement with Torres's assessment, adding his own perspective based on months of observing Marcus's work in the maintenance areas. Hayes had developed respect for Marcus's attention to detail and quiet competence, qualities that had seemed inconsistent with his official job description. Colonel, Hayes said, Mr. Washington has consistently demonstrated knowledge and professionalism that exceeded what we expected from custodial personnel. I think Sergeant Torres is right that he could make significant contributions to squadron operations if given appropriate opportunities.
Bennett felt confirmed in her instinct that Marcus represented an underutilized human resource whose experience could benefit the squadron in multiple ways.
The colonel was also aware that her handling of the situation would demonstrate important values about second chances, recognizing talent regardless of current circumstances, and treating all personnel with appropriate respect.
Mr.
Washington, Bennett said, I'm going to propose something that will require coordination with base civilian personnel and, possibly some creative administrative work.
I'd like to explore transferring you to a position within squadron operations that utilizes your pilot background while accommodating your medical restrictions.
Marcus felt emotions welling up that he had kept suppressed for months. The possibility of returning to meaningful work that utilized his experience and expertise represented more than just a job change. It offered the chance to reclaim his professional identity and self-respect that had been slowly eroding during his time as custodial staff.
Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control, that opportunity would mean more to me than I can express. I've missed being part of aviation operations more than I realized until this morning.
Bennett understood the emotional significance of what she was proposing for Marcus. The colonel had seen other pilots struggle with medical discharges and the transition to civilian employment, and she recognized that Marcus had been dealing with a form of professional death that was particularly difficult for people whose identities had been so closely tied to their military roles. I can't guarantee that we'll be able to make it work, Bennett said honestly, but I'm committed to exploring the possibilities. Your experience is too valuable to waste, and this morning's incident has demonstrated that you still have much to contribute to Air Force operations. Captain Mitchell had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding of the deeper issues involved in the morning's events. The revelation of Marcus's background had forced Mitchell to confront not just his own arrogance, but also his failure to recognize the value and dignity of people whose current circumstances didn't reflect their capabilities or contributions. Ma'am, Mitchell said, addressing Bennett but looking at Marcus, if there's anything I can do to support Mr.
Washington's transition to a position that better utilizes his experience, I'd like to volunteer for whatever assistance might be helpful.
The offer surprised everyone present, including Marcus, who looked at Mitchell with something approaching amazement. The young captain's willingness to actively support the man he had been condescending to hours earlier suggested that the morning's events had produced genuine learning rather than just embarrassment. Bennett noted Mitchell's offer with approval, recognizing it as evidence that the captain was processing the lessons of the experience constructively. The colonel was always pleased to see personnel demonstrate growth and maturity in response to their mistakes rather than simply accepting punishment passively.
Thank you, Captain, Bennett said.
That attitude represents the kind of leadership and teamwork I expect from my officers.
I'll keep your offer in mind as we work through the administrative details.
The immediate crisis had passed, but Bennett understood that the morning's events had revealed issues that extended beyond the specific incident. The colonel was determined to use the situation as an opportunity to reinforce important values about respect, recognition of talent, and the way squadron personnel treated each other regardless of official job titles. Before we conclude this matter, Bennett said, addressing the entire group, I want everyone to understand the broader lessons from what happened here today.
Mr. Washington's background reminds us that people's current circumstances don't always reflect their capabilities or contributions.
Captain Mitchell's behavior demonstrates the importance of treating all personnel with respect and avoiding assumptions based on job titles or organizational hierarchies. The colonel paused, ensuring that her words were registering with everyone present before continuing with the specific expectations she wanted to establish for future interactions. Moving forward, I expect every member of this squadron to treat all base personnel with the respect they deserve as professional contributors to our mission. That includes custodial staff, maintenance personnel, administrative workers, and everyone else whose work enables our operations. Excellence in military aviation requires teamwork and mutual respect at every level. Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude not just for the potential opportunities Colonel Bennett had described, but for the restoration of his dignity as a professional and a person. The morning had begun with yet another instance of casual disrespect, but it was ending with recognition of his value and potential for meaningful contribution. 6 months later, Marcus Washington sat in the squadron briefing room as the senior pilot training coordinator, reviewing lesson plans for new A-10 pilots with the same attention to detail he had once applied to mission planning. His transition from custodial staff to training positions had required extensive administrative coordination, but Colonel Bennett had made it a personal priority that demonstrated her commitment to utilizing talent regardless of bureaucratic obstacles. Captain Mitchell had completed his administrative punishment and had developed into a more thoughtful and respectful officer. His personal apology to Marcus had been genuine and heartfelt, marking the beginning of a professional relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. Mitchell's flying skills had improved significantly under Marcus's guidance, and he had become an advocate for recognizing and utilizing the expertise of all squadron personnel. The transformation that began with an arrogant dare in a maintenance hangar had evolved into lasting changes that benefited the entire squadron. Marcus had found redemption and renewed purpose in work that utilized his experience while accommodating his limitations. Mitchell had learned crucial lessons about leadership, respect, and the danger of assumptions based on appearances. Most importantly, the incident had established cultural changes that emphasized the value and dignity of all personnel regardless of their official positions. Colonel Bennett's handling of the situation had demonstrated that good leadership involved recognizing talent wherever it existed and creating opportunities for people to contribute their best efforts to shared missions. The story of the captain who dared the janitor to start an A-10 became squadron legend, but not for the reasons anyone had initially expected. It became a reminder that respect, recognition, and second chances could transform apparent disasters into opportunities for growth, learning, and improved effectiveness. The sound of those engines roaring to life had announced not just one man's demonstration of hidden skills, but the beginning of changes that made everyone involved better at their jobs and better as human beings.